as she has to perform lots of sprints, dodges, and passes, which may benefit from a higher level of arousal to give her more confidence and drive in order to win the ball and beat her opponents. But Sarah, being a goal shooter like Nick, needs less arousal in order to concentrate on shooting the ball through the net consistently. So if she has too much arousal, this may affect her concentration and she may start to miss, which we can see that her scoring average in the crunch games is particularly lower in the normal matches. And this graph just further highlights what I've just said, how that if we are under aroused, we have a low level of arousal, our performance is low. This means we are bored and we have a less interest in the sport. We're not psyched up enough. We're not going to be performing at our best, which is why it's good to have medium to moderate levels of arousal, and this is good for our best optimum performance, so we perform highly, physically and mentally as well. And we're excited about performing, we want to perform, we're driven, we're motivated. However, once we reach a point where our arousal becomes too much, we enter what's known as the stress zone. We become anxious, we have fear, we start to panic, and we lose our performance. And we can see that our performance deteriorates, becomes lower when the overload becomes too high. We're too over-aroused, we're paying attention to the wrong cues, we're not focusing on the game, our head's sort of all over the place, we're not really in the games we were before. And that just explains the arousal that Sarah is experiencing high levels of arousal, so she's in the stress zone. That's why she's anxious before the games, that's why she's anxious during the games, she doesn't want to upset people, and that's why it's having a knock-on effect on her shooting technique. Whereas we can see with Rachel, she has moderate levels of arousal, which means she can thrive on the atmosphere, and therefore she performs at her optimum performance. One theory of arousal that can be used to explain Sarah's high levels of arousal is the inverted U theory, and this theory suggests that there is not a linear relationship like the drive theory, but as arousal increases, so does performance, but only to a certain extent. It sort of represents a more curvilinear sort of shape. Yerk Dodson 1908 proposed the idea of the inverted U graph that follows an inverted shape. It shows that arousal levels affect performance in low, moderate and high levels depending on the individual. We can see on the graphs that low levels of arousal shows that as arousal increases gradually to a point, performance increases. But at the start, when arousal levels are low, so is our performance. So the performer is therefore under-aroused and not focused. This means they have a wide attention field where they're distracted and their concentration is affected. They're not focusing on the game, they're focusing on the external cues. At the other end of the scale, we have high arousal, or over-aroused. This is where arousal turns into anxiety, so our performance weakens due to having too narrow attention fields, due to being hypervigilant and being too overwhelmed in the situation. We have this inability to cope. When an athlete, according to this graph, has moderate levels of arousal, we can see that they have their optimum performance. It shows that we need some arousal to perform well, but not too little or too much, as we can be too unfocused and too stressed. This is because the attention field is an ideal width, so we have high concentration to make the right decisions quickly and selectively attend the important cues due to being at the optimum point of arousal. We can see that Sarah becomes over-aroused in the crunch games against Lewis and Vandine as her scoring average falls to 32%. This could be because of the pressure of the spectators, and she may not want to embarrass herself, and the home crowd adds extra pressure to perform well, especially in the rival games. The opposition may make comments which can distract her also. Sarah in the normal matches has some arousal, but the arousal is at her optimum point where it allows her to work at her best. But during the crunch matches, Sarah's level of arousal exceeds the amount at which she can cope, and the high level of arousal results in the gradual deterioration of performance, because she has become too over-aroused. One reason for this is, as we have mentioned, perceptual narrowing, which is the inability to focus on the right cues by having an ineffective cue utilisation. Nideffer 1976 argued that increased arousal levels can actually result in changes in the attention span and the ability to concentrate of the individual. These high levels can result from the athlete having too much information to try to process at once, like Sarah, who is trying to process her shooting technique, the spectators, her teammates, like Rachel particularly, the opposition, and therefore the pressure of actually winning the match. This narrowing of her attention field means she is unable to process all these external factors, which results in her paying attention to the wrong cues, like the spectators, rather than the match itself and her shooting technique. Therefore, she makes poorer decisions, which makes her panic. When we become more aroused, we don't filter the information properly and process it. So this means that Sarah is less aware of the situation and is scanning the field less often. And the graph just highlights what we've said. It's more of a gradual decrease in performance as the physiological arousal increases. And we can see with this graph on the left that it's also to do with the task differences, which we will come to in a minute, and how this is the same effect how we have when we have low arousal, we have low performance until we meet, as we increase the arousal levels to our moderate levels, we then have near our optimum high performance, and then this is a gradual deterioration when we have high arousal. This theory indicates that there's clearly a relationship between the levels of arousal and the quality of the performance, in that when individuals experience the right amount of arousal, they can perform at their optimum. But if there is too little or too much arousal, then their performance suffers. Unlike drive theory, it accounts for various factors in how people react to pressures in different situations, and by managing these, it can support athletes in finding their optimum level of positive pressure to maintain their well-being and peak performance. So Sarah can use this theory in order to try to find her optimum levels of arousal, so she can try to prevent her performance from deteriorating by trying to reduce the arousal levels to a point where she can manage them and not affect her performance, so she doesn't panic and become too stressed. However, this theory doesn't account for why performers fail sometimes and don't perform their best. The theory suggests that once we become highly aroused, there is a gradual decline in performance, but this is not the case always. For example, in quick fire, like taking a penalty in football, the pressure causes performance to decline rapidly, even though the footballers are clearly capable, they're experienced performers. This is one limitation of this theory, is that it doesn't account for those performances. For example, an autonomous performer may perform better when they are highly aroused, but compared to a novice performer, having high arousal levels will have a detrimental effect on their performance, as they may crumble under the pressure and would work better at lower levels of arousal. As they are less experienced, they're not really aware of the environment and how sort of much the crowd can actually influence your decisions and your sort of state of mind. So this is why they would require less arousal to concentrate, compose themselves, so they can actually focus on their performance and the competition. It might be also true in certain skills. For example, a simple explosive skill. If you are more highly aroused, you may perform the skill better because you are more confident you can execute it accurately. So for example, in long jump. But more complex skills may require lower levels, so the performer can concentrate on the task to make the correct decisions to execute the skills properly. So complex skills more like the technique in archery or the technique in javelin, the different phases. There is variation in different performers' optimal levels of arousal in which they perform their best. If we look at this in different contexts, like a kicker in rugby would most probably perform better at lower levels of arousal, depending on how well they can handle pressure. This is because the skill requires lots of skill and concentration in order to kick the ball accurately through the goal. However, compared to a boxer in boxing who would benefit from high levels of arousal from the spectators, the boxer would probably most have a high optimum level of arousal than the kicker, in order to increase the opposition's arousal, to intimidate them and then affect their performance because they are over-aroused. It has also been shown that introverts perform better at lower levels of arousal than extroverts in team sports. Typically, they function best at high levels of arousal, and this then causes the curve to shift. It also applies to their level of experience. If you're more experienced, your curve may be shifted to the right, where you perform at an optimum of a higher level of arousal because you can deal with the pressure, compared to a novice performer whose curve may be shifted further to the left. Another factor that is affected is the classification of skill, and the skill level will be affected. So gross motor skills, which are simple skills, individuals can cope with higher levels of arousal, but more complex and fine motor skills benefit from having lower levels of arousal because they require more concentration to execute the multiple subroutines. And we said that the classification of skill can also affect the arousal, and that fine motor skills benefit more from having lower levels of arousal as they require more concentration to execute the multiple subroutines. So this relates to Sarah, as her skill is more a fine motor skill, therefore she would need lower levels of arousal in order to concentrate, sort of process it, the shot, visualising it, going in, to take more time rather than Rachel, whose sort of role is more of a gross motor skill, sprinting, dodging, as we said before. Sarah could work with her coach and teammates to try to develop certain strategies to try to recognise the signs of arousal, and when she experiences anxiety, so they can try to control this. They've established that when she feels anxiety is in the crunch games leading up to the crunch games, and now that they know that this is where she feels the anxiety, they can try to reduce this arousal so she can have more confidence and self-control. Because she is suffering with state anxiety, we can develop her cognitive skills to help view the anxiety as facilitative, where she perceives she has an ability to cope with demands to reach the goal of scoring the most shots, and not as debilitative anxiety, which is the negative expectancies of the ability to cope and reach her goals. An example of a cognitive technique Sarah can adopt in her training program is positive self-talk, which is where she would develop positive thoughts about herself in terms of her actions and performances in an attempt to eradicate the negative thoughts she is experiencing leading up to the crunch games, and during them to replace them with more positive ideals. This links with the idea of thought stopping, where Sarah would recognise the development of her negative thoughts and then respond with a positive word or action in order to redirect her to a more positive mindset. Sarah could do this in the crunch game especially by telling herself she is talented, an excellent shooter, anything that will just make her feel more confident in herself, to remind her that the mindset she is normally in, to try to reduce the levels of arousal. So it sort of will allow her to regain this state of positive mindset and sort of reduce the negative thinking that she is experiencing. Just taking some time to think, maybe when the ball is down the opposite end of the court, just to reflect on herself and just take a moment for her to compose herself before she actually has to make the shot, will just help her to be more positive and potentially try to reduce her arousal levels so she doesn't panic. Rachel, unlike Sarah, is showing signs of eustress, which is when the body responds in a positive way to the stress. This can result in them experiencing their optimal level of arousal. Rachel thrives on the atmosphere of the crunch games, and it is an optimal level for her, which allows her to thrive off the pressure, which makes her more control of her performance than Sarah. This allows her to perform at her best, and this is why she receives Player of the Match several times. This is because Rachel's mindset is positive towards the situation. Therefore, she can respond positively, physically, mentally, and emotionally to retain her concentration and focus. This allows her to rise to the challenge and have more motivation, as she has the drive to win. If she makes a mistake like a bad pass or the ball goes out of play, she responds positively to this, and this gives her the confidence to perform better and win the ball back, so the team can make the appropriate passes to Sarah towards the goal. Rachel was very aware of her environment, and therefore she can control her levels of arousal so they do not exceed her optimum level, and therefore so she can retain her performance and thrive off the pressure. Because she has more control, this allows her to control the symptoms, the cognitive, somatic, and behavioural, so she can prevent the fidgeting, she can prevent the increased blood pressure and heart rate, and the idea of her concentration not being affected.